Joining me now is Jonathan Laurence. He's author of The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims. He's with me here in Paris. National security analyst Bob Baer and former NYPD detective Harry Hoke. Jonathan, if I could begin with you tonight, because you have, in effect, a dual threat right now. You have a clear terror threat to Jewish targets in the city and around the country, as we saw yesterday in the attack on the kosher market. But you've also had a number of reprisal attacks against Islamic institutions, synagogues, some kebab shops, that kind of thing. It's coming from both sides. How does a society counteract that invariable human emotion of revenge on one side, but also the terror threat on the other?
Well, it's something we're familiar with, I think, from the aftermath of 9/11, when we, too, had to come together as a country in the face of what was really a divisive, polarizing act. And that's what the trick is here, to call for national unity. The politicians have done that. They want to get the mainstream parties together. Right now they have for tomorrow's march, but not all parties will participate. Some of them have decided to hold their own rallies, and that is not a great sign, frankly.
Have leaders done it? Of course, I remember the moment after 9/11 when George Bush, President George W. Bush at the time, very quickly went to a mosque in Washington to demonstrate, this does not represent the Islamic faith. We are not against Islam as we fight this war on terrorism. Have French leaders made similar gestures here?
Yes, the good news is that for the last 12, 15 years, actually, really since around 9/11, French leaders have been reaching out to Muslim community leaders. They have created a forum called the French Council for the Muslim Faith, and so they're very familiar with one another. And immediately after the attack, you saw leaders from the French Muslim community go directly to the Charlie Hebdo site to pay their respects. And that's something that is continuing today.
Tremendously important. We're going to see a similar diversity in that march tomorrow. Well, Jonathan, though, France has taken other steps, including banning the wearing of the niqab, a Muslim woman's headdress that covers their faces, which was a step at the time that was very controversial because France wanted to show its common values. Did it not?
Yes, absolutely. In 2010, 2011, the country held what was called a national debate on national identity, and one of the main concrete outcomes of that was a ban on burqas. The thing is that not very many French women ever wore a burqa. There were probably around 1,500 total. So that was never a real problem. But the issue of radicalization is serious, and it's something that the French anti-terrorism squads have been following very closely. French intelligence is really is well known for its casework on this, and it's something that the U.S. relies on heavily.
No question. And as we know, intelligence services, they're constantly learning, because this is a relatively new process, this outreach to Muslim communities, in particular to help identify and prevent recruiting for extremism and extremist thoughts, a constant adjustment in strategy over time. Bob Baer, Harry Hoke, thanks very much for joining us in the U.S. Jonathan from good old Boston College here, thanks for joining me. Joining me now, Professor Jonathan Laurence from Boston College. He's with me here in Paris. American viewers may not know this, but France has a very large Muslim population. I believe the number is about 5 million out of 50 million, is that right? About 1 in 10?
5 to 6 million out of 62 million.
So is there has been criticism that the Muslim community here less integrated than in the U.S., a bit more insular, the community is more divided from the wider population, and also some economic challenges in that community. Does that help, does that division help seed extremism, or at least lay the groundwork to make many of these angry young men, for lack of a better word, more easy targets for extremist groups?
Well, the last point you made about the economic situation, I think, is very important. The main distinction between French Muslims and American Muslims is that the French ones came here under very different circumstances. As workers, their parents, their grandparents came here to help rebuild France after the Second World War. And as such, were mostly manual laborers, not necessarily from a high education background. That's the opposite situation in the United States, where the average Muslim is actually better educated and earns more. So the situation in the banlieue, which are the outskirts of the major French cities, is at times very precarious for these young men in a time when the economy is suffering. And that in itself, of course, does not make someone vulnerable to terrorist recruitment.
Right.
But the fact is that other aspects, including difficult political integration, difficulties expressing religious life as a Muslim in France, could add to that feeling of alienation.
Feeling that they have a future, and that feeling of alienation is certainly not confined to the West, because that's a major issue in Middle Eastern countries lack of opportunity that those countries will cite, as well as laying the groundwork for temptation to go into extremism. And it is hoped a show of unity for France. Many developments today. With me to discuss all of this here in Paris, Boston College professor Jonathan Laurence. He is also author of The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims, CNN terror analyst Paul Cruikshank, along with CNN national security analyst, former CIA operative Bob Baer, and CNN global affairs analyst, retired Delta Force Army officer Lieutenant Colonel James Reese. Jonathan, I wonder if I could ask you, let's talk about that audio. It gives you a remarkable window, not just inside a terror attack as it's happening, as you had this hostage taking at this kosher market, but also inside the mind of a recruit to terrorism, a French national here, describing why he targets civilians. What did you hear here, and is that a familiar justification to you?
Well, I think it's the confused mind of a confused person. There is very little sense and very little coherence to the arguments he made, starting with, of course, the note about the headscarf ban in French schools. It's wrong to tell only the part of the story where the French government bans Islamic symbols. The French government has also been very active in helping to open mosques, helping to train imams, helping to make Muslims feel at home in France. Because of this system of laïcité, of secularism, it allows for religion and religious life in the public sphere.
And to be fair, France bans other religious symbolism as well, wearing of crosses, for instance, in state schools, etc. So it's certainly not singling out one faith in these these attempts to keep a sort of national identity.
Well, he's right that Muslims do feel targeted by legislation like that, and a lot of the issues that are raised around laïcité do come up precisely because of this new Muslim presence.
And explain laïcité just to our viewers in the U.S.
Well, the idea is that you keep the public sphere neutral, and you leave your religious identity, in a sense, at home. However, it also allows for full religious liberty, and that's very important. French citizenship is an ideal that is constantly being achieved, but it's a universalist ideal, and it's something that's accessible to all, and that's important to remember.
Very delicate balance there. Boston College political science professor Jonathan Laurence, he's here with me in Paris. He's also the author of The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims. Jonathan, another major thing we are watching, of course, is this rally plan for tomorrow. Perhaps 1 million French will take part, showing defiance, showing unity in response to these attacks. World leaders as well. Benjamin Netanyahu's presence here, certainly powerful. He said something interesting in announcing his trip here, that telling France's Jews that Israel is their home. What did you read into that message?
Well, Israel is the home of all Jews. Jews have the right of return to Israel ever since its founding. But there's a 2,000-year history of Jewish diaspora, and there's no reason to let these three very deadly clowns change that.
Right.
There's a cynical point of view on the one hand, because French Jews have been protected, but not protected enough, and the French are going to have to probably look at the Germany to see whether or not there's a possibility of putting tanks or more armed vehicles at the disposition of the Jewish institutions that clearly need protection. On the other hand, you don't want to stigmatize them too much. But the fact is that French Jews don't feel well protected, and a record number of them emigrated to Israel this year, and that is a flow that the French are going to have to stem.
And still a great feeling of that threat, where you have the main synagogue here closed for the first time since World War II, fear of additional attacks. Jonathan, thanks very much.